Hi, I'm Scott.
And I'm Jamie.
And welcome to God or Not, the podcast where truth springs from argument among friends. This is episode number 11. And coming up, Jamie and I will be talking about objectivity in morality. Also in this episode, spin the wheel. So grab your popcorn, sit back, and enjoy the show.
Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to the center ring. This is the God or Not podcast. We're in for a great night of civil discourse here as these two warriors are revved up and ready to go. First, in the red corner, hailing from the great state of Ohio, he's a conservative, a Christian apologist, and a pastor, the minister of pain, Jamie Goodland. And in the blue corner from Minnesota, the land of 10,000 lakes, he's a progressive, an atheist, and a math teacher. He's a weapon of math instruction, Scott Dickey. And now, let's get ready to dialogue!
Hey, Jamie, welcome back. We're in 2020 now.
Yeah, Happy New Year.
2020, first episode of the shiny new year. You know what? Strangely enough, it still feels like 2019 to me.
Well, because every day up there looks the same. Dreary
Right.
and gray.
That's it. Well,
hey, do you have any New Year's resolutions?
Yeah, actually, my wife and I have well, it's not really a New Year's resolution, but we've decided that we're going to try to, I mentioned last time about how we had our little running, our running goals. And so my wife and I we're going to try to bump up our running goals a little bit this year. And, that's basically it. I mean, not really a resolution, but it is a goal. I suppose it is. It's
You're
a goal we have for this year.
Certifiably crazy, Scott. Certifiably running. I've never understood that, but hey, maybe that's because I was never a runner.
You can keep calling me crazy when I'm 95 years old and still
quote,
kicking.
Big boned, so I didn't do a lot of running.
Not a lot of running.
That's right.
Do you have any resolutions for this year?
I always have a few. We want to give more, and we'd like to find some people, like, instead of just giving in, I don't know, in your kind of normal kind of way, we're hoping to do some more stuff that involves individuals who we know need certain things, and so we could kind of reach out anonymously and pay this off or do that. And so we're hoping to do that. Of course, I could lose a few 100 pounds. Not quite that much, but I could lose some weight. So I'd like to start eating a little more healthy. I think we all could do
that.
So, your typical.
So you're basically run-of-the-mill kind of thing. Just be a better person kind of thing.
Pretty much. Yep. That's it.
All right.
Yep.
Say, so let me ask you this. You probably don't have an opinion on this, but yesterday I saw two people talking about, is 2020 the last year of a decade, or is it the first year of a decade? Do you know what I mean? Have you heard any of that? Have you heard any?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. Is there a technically correct?
No, there's not. But I heard maybe this is just me, just a math nerd here, hearing people discussing this, but one of them was saying, well, I mean, if we start counting years at year number one, year 100 is the last year of the first century. So the year 2000 was not a new millennium. It was the last year of the second millennium, right? And so then 2001 is actually the first year of the next one. But on the other hand, and I think that's a legitimate argument. But on the other side, the other person was saying, yeah, but we're out of the 2010s. We're not in the teens anymore. Now we're in the 20s, which is also a legitimate argument. And the thing that struck me
somebody's got to be right. Somebody has to be right.
But so my comment was that you're both right in that actually every moment of every day is the beginning and the end of a decade. It just depends on what you're counting. So if you're so it's the end of the teens are done, and we're into the 2020s, but it's technically the last year of the second decade of the 2000s.
Yeah, I think you're wrong. See, that just shows our listeners that we can argue about anything.
Right, exactly. You know what? I think that you actually think I'm right.
I have no idea what to think now.
All right. So anyway, in this, so back to business here. We got some interesting discussions coming up here, and in this first discussion of the new year, we're going to be dipping our toes back into the well of, is that a saying? Dip your toes in the well?
Sure.
Dip our toes into the pond.
It is now.
Of that morality pond. And so we're going to be talking in this case about objectivity in morality. So let's just get rolling on that.
This is the main event. Round 3.
All right. So tonight we're going to be continuing our discussion on morality. And just to do a little recap, so this will be round 3. We've done a couple
three, fight.
Ready, go. We've done a couple of chats, and so round 1, basically, we were talking about Jamie. You were asking me about how I could envision a moral system without a God, an objective moral basis that's separate from any kind of a God belief or a God. And so just basically a rundown of what my argument was that I proposed a morality that's based on demonstrable well-being of conscious creatures. And so then I would judge an action to be moral if it demonstrably promotes well-being, at least in theory. There might be some things that are difficult to demonstrate in practice, but if at least in theory it can demonstrably promote well-being, then it would be moral, and immoral if it promoted harm. And
so you're saying that there's those gray areas would be those that you would subcategorize as non-demonstratable. Is that what you were talking about?
Whether or not something is objectively true or not is a separate issue from whether or not we are actually capable of recognizing whether it's true or not. Right. So there are some things that are objectively true. For example, there is a certain color to the material in the center of the earth, right? But that's not something that we can. I mean, there's an objective reality there. I mean, there's going to be some stuff there, and it's going to have a color, but obviously that's not something that we can demonstrate at the moment, or even ever. So that's kind of what I was saying there. It's just, at least in theory, has to be demonstrable. And then moral duties. We didn't really talk about moral duties. I know it was mentioned, but go figure. We ran out of time. We got on our roll. We were on a roll, and so we didn't really have time to bring up moral duties. But I'll just throw it out there, and in case it comes up today. Moral duties arise from the fact that we're a social species, and so since we're living together, we would have certain responsibilities to each other and to our society and so on. And so
you would define duties as those things that we're obligated to do.
Yeah,
I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. I'm just trying to
no, that's fair.
Duties.
Right. But duties means that something that we're either expected or obligated to do as members of a society. Okay. And then so I talked about demonstrable well-being and harm, whether or not it's an objective moral standard. I think it was, I'm not, I don't want to put words into your mouth here, but I think it was pretty clear that at least it was objectively measuring something. If we can demonstrate harm, then there's something objective there. It's not dependent on whether or not somebody has an opinion, whether or not it's harmful. If we can demonstrate that it's harmful or demonstrate that it's...
I think that the determining factor is that we had to distinguish hurt from harm. And I think that we would probably need to define those in like, we can demonstrate hurt.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that possibly has some kind of basis there, but I'm not sure about harm. So in order to expedite let's just say I'm not...
What would be the difference there between hurt and harm? What do you mean? I don't understand that.
Well, hurt would be more of a physical thing. So you could physically demonstrate, like I chopped off their finger.
Right.
Right. So that is hurt, where harm could also incorporate other things that like social type of rights and wrongs. Does that make sense?
Well,
so one's physical and one's physical and one's not. All I'm saying is that I haven't necessarily agreed that we can come up with an objective standard for harm.
Well, I mean,
but I don't. But my point was that sit on that today.
But if it's demonstrable, there might be things that are difficult to demonstrate, and we might not know if they're harmful, and that's fine. But if it's something that you can
objective, then it would be subjective.
Well, no, I'm saying that if we couldn't demonstrate the harm, then we couldn't say it was immoral.
Okay.
So that's what I'm tying the that's why I say demonstrable, at least in theory. For example, if we wanted to say that if people forced themselves to write with their left hand instead of their right, okay, that's difficult, but we could do studies to show whether or not that does harm to a society. It would just be a difficult thing for us to do immediately. We could that's something that could be investigated, and maybe it would take time for us to really understand whether or not it is in fact harmful or helpful. But it's still something that we could examine, and that we could demonstrate in theory whether or not it was harmful or helpful. Does that make sense?
It does, but for the sake of time, I just think we should continue moving on, because obviously I know this is going to be, and I'm not sure I agree all with that, but we're not here this episode isn't here to unpack.
Okay, that's fine. So we can move on. Yep. Okay. So one thing I wanted to bring up again, and that is we did mention, or it was brought up briefly during that round one. By the way, just I want to talk briefly about the round two, just a couple of sentences here, and that was a lot of fun. I think that what we ended up doing for the round two. If you haven't, for anybody that hasn't listened to it yet, basically what we did is we started talking about what we were going to do for our talk right now. And we ended up having this big, long discussion about how we should approach it and what we should do. And then we just decided, okay, let's make that an episode. And so we, we cut that one and
in the trenches.
Rolled it out.
Like this is podcast 101 in the trenches with Scott and Jamie. So
it's like the B-roll, right? It's the B-roll. It's the behind the scenes stuff.
That's right.
So anyway, okay. So now, so we mentioned briefly, at least a variation of the Euthyphro dilemma, in which basically was that, this is based off of your take on morality, which in a nutshell, I know there's some nuance to it, but in a nutshell, it's basically whatever God says to do, that's what you should do. And so then my question was, okay, well, is it, is it moral to do that because that's what God says, or does God say that because it's a moral thing? And which is it's a slight tweak from the actual Euthyphro dilemma, which talks about piety rather than morality, but it's the same kind of argument.
Same idea.
And, yeah. And so the idea there is that if it's moral just because God says so, then it seems kind of arbitrary. And if it's if the other way around, if God says so because it's moral, then it has to be moral separate from God. And so that way we should be able to, again, at least in theory, determine that without a God. And so you suggested that, that wasn't a true dilemma, which Well, kind of. I mean, the definition of dilemma is kind of loose
A
there.
or not A. Well, the definition of a dilemma is A or not A.
Not necessarily. Not dilemma just means two lemmas, two suggestions, two statements. So basically, a dilemma is a comparison of two possibilities, very often presented at an A or not A. And this one kind of is that. You suggested there was a third possibility, and that possibility was that God dictated according to his nature, which basically was goodness or was morality. I don't know. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. I'll give you the 30-second bit. So as a theist, we believe that goodness is based from God's nature. So God is the good. So God doesn't have to look to a standard outside himself, and he just doesn't decide, I'm going to make murder bad. That isn't the case. That the third option is just God is the good. He is our stopping point, and that it flows out of the goodness flows from his nature. So his commands come from the fact that he is good, and those obligations and duties come from his commands. Okay,
so I know it sounds nice. I'm not really sure what you mean by flows from him. What is that? The goodness. What does that mean?
It just means that it is an attribute of God. That just like God has.
So how do we?
Omniscience. He's all knowing. He's all powerful. He's also all good. He's perfectly morally good. And so just like those other attributes come from God, so does goodness or oughtness.
Okay. So the question I asked last time was, if God's nature were different, then would murder be good? If God's nature were different and God said you should murder, would that be a moral thing then for us to do?
Now, I hate to do this because I know this isn't kind of what we wanted to go, but give me a minute to explain. Okay, so I think it's impossible for God's nature to be any other way. And this is because God is what we call the greatest conceivable being, or he is a maximally great being. And what that means is that part of that means he's worthy of worship. And as a theist, we believe that these qualities of him being morally perfect and all-powerful and those kind of things make him a maximally great being. So he would not be God if his nature deviated from moral
goodness.
Perfection. From his. So like he wouldn't be God if he didn't have the nature that he does. So we wouldn't be human if we didn't have our human nature. He wouldn't be God if he didn't have the nature of God or the attributes of God. So, but he is. And so like, I'm not trying to sidestep it. Like, I don't want you to think that I'm running from some kind of question. He doesn't have an answer for that. So he's trying to juke and jive. That isn't the case, because I think we had mentioned maybe in round one that it's a lot like the question, have you stopped beating your wife? Like, I don't think I can answer that question, because I would never beat my wife to begin with, but to have a yes or no answer, I think would kind of make me answer a question in a way that would be false. Now, if you say we were in a totally different world and there's a totally different kind of God, and that God within his nature was killing, was good, then yeah, I suppose we would follow that which flows from God's nature. But in that world, he wouldn't be a maximally great being. I don't think he would then be defined as God.
Well, let me rephrase the question then, and I'll rephrase it the same way that I did last time, and that is, So what if in fact so you're saying God can only be one way because that's good, right? So that's the thing. That's the maximal nature of the, the moral perfection there. So what if our understanding or your understanding of God's nature is wrong? What if in fact God's nature is such that it is good to murder? I know that's tough for us to imagine because we see it as bad. We see that as immoral. But again, we're fallible human beings. And so what if you were mistaken about what you thought God's nature was and then later discovered that?
Well, you're right. Anything is possible. Right.
So would you say then that murder is a good thing?
No. And here's why. I think that just as we can see the world around us through our sight, and we can smell things with our senses, with our nose, I also think that moral oughtness is so clear in certain circumstances, in certain instances, that it is just as real as our other senses. So I would argue that we know torturing a baby for fun is wrong just as much as we could see something with our eyes. Obviously, it's in a different sense, but it's that what they would call that a properly basic belief. So I think that, and I think that you might agree with me in a certain instance that some of these moral duties and obligations, some of these oughtnesses are so obvious that to deny them would be almost as crazy as denying other properly basic beliefs, like there are other minds around me, or there is an external world. I think those are all properly basic beliefs, and I also think that certain moral obligations, at least the real basic ones, are that kind of obvious, and then to deny those would be would be crazy. So let me ask you. Well, I'm not quite finished. I would just say that it would be. I don't think that God could have a nature other than what he does. And I think that we've properly understood at least parts of his nature based upon these properly basic beliefs. That it just is so obvious to us that torturing a baby for fun is wrong and we ought not do it. That any argument to the contrary would have to be equally as powerful, and I just don't see how we could make one.
So let me ask you about. So I've heard the phrase "properly basic belief" used in a few different ways. So why don't you are you saying that a properly basic belief is just a belief in something that can't be otherwise? Is that it, or
no?
Is that...
No, I think that it's a belief in something that is just so obvious to us that to believe otherwise would just be so.
So it's amazing. A matter of our perception of the situation, because we know that our perceptions can be wrong.
Well, that's true, but I think that everybody who's conscious would say that there's an external world. At least almost everybody. I think that almost everybody would say that they could see certain things and that there are objects other than themselves. And that so those kind of things are properly basic. And I think that as long as people are endowed with kind of normal faculties, your basic kind of faculties that the majority of human beings are born with, that those are really just basic and easy to understand. That's why they're called properly basic. And this is not like a theist thing. Of course, I think there's most philosophers, I think, understand that there are these properly basic beliefs. So they'll argue what some of them could be, but I think a lot of us would say, hey, the external world, that there are minds other than my own, that the world has got like a dimension of time in it, that we actually perceive some kind of time, whether that's A theory, B theory, doesn't matter, that there is some kind of coming into being and coming out of being, that time passes or
right.
that kind of thing. So I think that would be like a properly basic belief. And I think that some moral obligations can be hinged or can be put into that category as properly basic. And so for God to have, or for us to be misunderstanding some of those basic attributes of God, I think that
well, we do know that we can misunderstand. There are things that we learn that we've been wrong about, that it looks so obvious to us for so long. So we know that we can be wrong about things, even
Can you give me an example?
Sure, yeah. There was a time when everyone thought the world was flat, and they were wrong. Even though everybody thought that.
That's not a properly basic belief, though. That's not a belief that see, a properly basic belief is one that you hold, and that you are right to hold without any real evidence in terms of.
So you're saying that our moral sense is not really because the reason that I brought up that example was because it seemed to me that you were using our senses as an analogy for our moral sense, and so that's
I was saying that they're obviously very different categories, but that. I don't think that the world being flat is a properly basic belief. I would say that the external world is here, that there are other things other than me is a properly basic belief.
You know what? Let's pause. Let's push the pause button on the properly basic belief. Maybe we can talk about that a different time. Let's move on and let's talk about morality and its relation to God. Okay,
sounds good.
Is that okay? All right. So then. I wanted to ask you that we talked about, you said that morality was going to be based off of God's nature. So you're saying that God's nature could not have been different. Is that what you're saying? It had to be this way.
Yeah, I think that, because he's the only thing that is worthy of worship would be a maximally great being, and he has to be morally perfect.
Okay, so then
that's a part of God's nature. God wouldn't be God if he wasn't morally perfect.
Right, and so the idea there is that we can intuit or we can reason our way to the attributes of God based off of this, this brute fact that it has to be this way. Is that right? Or
yeah, I think so. Without going on any further, I think that's probably fair.
So then, don't you think we could? If we can infer these necessary qualities off of this God's nature, and then we can infer morality off of God's nature, then couldn't we come to that same conclusion even if there was no God?
Come to the same conclusion that
can't we come if morality has to be the way that it is, if it has to be the case that torturing a baby for fun is moral, then what do we need God to tell us about that for? We should be able to come up with that on our own. We should be able to reason our way to that conclusion without there being a God.
Sure, because there's a lot of people that say that don't believe in God, who say that we attribute these moral obligations to kind of a herd, mentality, and kind of a herd through evolutionary process. So sure, but I would argue that it's not objective. Then it's just based upon societal norms. If morality has to be if it has to be that's the case, that doing X action is immoral, then that's not something that depends on our society. It just depends on whether or not we take the time to follow the reasoning. If it has to be true, then it doesn't matter. It has to be true whether or not there's a God. It has to be true whether or not the Nazis won. It has to be true whether or not we live on the moon. It has to. No, That's not what I'm saying.
Oh, okay.
I think it has. What I'm saying is if there is no God, then I don't believe that we could come up with these obligations. I think that maybe we could come up with something that is beneficial for the herd or beneficial for society. But then again, see, I'm using a value judgment. I'm saying beneficial.
Okay.
Is to say what is beneficial. I mean, again, we could maybe scientifically show that things make, like if we do this, then humanity is going to grow and flourish. But I've always argued that just falls back into speciesism, bias towards one's own species. So I think that you do have to have God in order to have an obligatory type of situation, but you don't have to have, you don't have to know those. Or you don't have to believe in God to know those. I think that's epistemological.
So morality is contingent upon the existence of God. Is that what you're saying?
Objective morality. Or because you could, obviously society could come up with things that they believe help.
I'm talking about your view of morality. I'm talking about
God has to exist for there to be an objective standard.
Okay. And you're also saying that God could only exist in one particular way.
Yeah, I'm saying that what makes him God is that he's morally perfect. And that if he wasn't morally perfect, then he wouldn't be God.
So even if there wasn't a God, then we could still argue what God would be like if there was a God.
I don't think if you don't have that standard, I mean, I don't know that there would be.
But if God can only be one way.
So are you talking like epistemology, like how we know it to be true?
No, I'm talking about if God's nature can only be, if it's only possible for God to turn out one particular way, and morality is an offshoot of that nature, that necessary nature. Right, then even if there was no God, we could still make an argument. We could still pursue and investigate. Well, what would a perfect morality be like if there was one?
Right.
If it can only be one way, then.
But that wouldn't give you objective. That would only give you, because when I say something is objective, I mean it would have to be. True regardless of what people think.
Yeah.
And so
that's what I'm saying.
What I'm saying is I don't think you can get to an objective without some standard.
Well, what I'm saying is if God's nature could only be one way, then a perfect morality can only be one way. You said that it wasn't a whim of God. It wasn't God's whim.
Right.
It's God's nature. And that you also said that we can infer God's nature philosophically and come to conclusions about what God's nature must be like. And that morality is an offshoot of that nature. And so if that's the case, then even if there was no God, we could still come to those same conclusions because they would still be true. There's still only one perfect morality that we could reason there because it's necessary. And then the morality would be an offshoot of that.
But wouldn't you need the yardstick to even know where to begin?
Well, if we do need the yardstick, then it's not necessary. It's contingent upon whether or not there is a God and how that God happens to be.
Right. That's what I'm saying. That God is the yardstick. Maybe, listen, maybe I don't understand what you're trying to say.
Well, you're saying that morality is a characteristic of a God, right?
Yes,
and you're saying that us as human beings can infer what the nature of that God is going to be like, of what the nature of God must be like.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that you could do that if you didn't have a standard. It's almost like, the whole idea of there being like, I think in the metric system, I think they actually had, like an actual in the Bureau of Weights and Measures, like an actual thing that was a meter or whatever, and that was the thing that we based the meter off of. The meter that meter stick had to exist in order for us to have that standard in which to look for. What I'm saying though is,
right, but that's an arbitrary standard.
But what I'm saying is, if there was no God, then we wouldn't be talking about maximally great beings, and I think that we'd have to have God to exist to even kind of compute that, to follow that line of thinking. So then what you're saying is that nature is not necessary, because it depends on whether or not that we can't come to that conclusion unless there is a God. Right.
Okay, so then if we are in fact wrong about God, or if God had turned out to be different, then our inferences would be based off of what?
The evolutionary process.
So what it seems to me that you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to me that you're not being consistent, that you're contradicting yourself. On one hand, you're saying that God's nature is necessarily a particular way, and that morality is a characteristic of that nature. And you're also saying that we can make certain inferences, certain as in a degree of certainty, we can make certain inferences about that nature. But then on the other, so then it would seem in that case that the existence of we don't need the existence of a God. We don't need that meter measure stick, because we can make inferences about it.
Well, we don't need the physical for it to be objective. You would need it to be objective. Of course, you could. If there's no God now, then what you're saying is exactly. If there is no God,
but if God's nature were necessary, were necessarily a particular way. You're saying that morality, perfect morality, has to be a particular way. If it's the case that it has to be a particular way, then it can't be dependent on whether or not a God exists.
No, well, what I'm saying is I think maybe we're misunderstanding. I'm saying the objectiveness of this. No. So I'm saying that this flows from God, that moral goodness or moral oughtness flows from God's nature. So we are all obligated to that because he is that objective standard.
Right. And so if you're talking about a meter, we don't need the meter long platinum bar or whatever they have for the stand. We don't need that, because a meter is defined as how far light travels in a certain number of seconds or something, however, there is a definition of what a meter is.
Right.
And it's not dependent on a physical bar.
So are you saying that we could have an understanding of what good is, or what ought to be the case without God? Yeah.
If this perfect moral nature were necessarily true, if it had to be true, if it was true in all cases, then it can't be dependent on the existence of a God, and it's still objective because we can arrive at it by reason and argument.
But that wouldn't make it objective.
That certainly would make it objective.
No. Wait,
it's independent of opinion. It's independent of opinion.
Yeah, but this is what we're arguing. We're arguing this very fact is whether or not this is objective. See, I don't know. I just am not following what you're trying to say about. I mean, listen. I mean, you've
let's move on then. Let's move on then. We don't need to.
Right. We can come back to this. I'm not trying to dodge this. I just don't think I understand what you're trying to say, and maybe I'm just thick.
That's it. I agree with you on that point. No, I'm kidding. We could talk about this for another 45 minutes and we might not let's set that aside. Maybe we'll come back to it. We'll see.
Okay.
And so I did want to talk about the idea of a God-based morality being objective, because clearly, I think it's clear, and hopefully it's not controversial. Hopefully you won't disagree with, but different people, even people who choose to base their morality on God, think different things are moral and different things are immoral.
Right.
Okay. And so it appears that they have, so this moral sense that you talked about before appears to be different. And so what do you say about that?
Well, I don't think they do, because, I think everyone wants the same thing. It's just that people use different means and methods to get it. So let me give you an example. So they have like a different perception of moral facts, but fundamentally they agree that the moral law should be upheld. So for instance, Indians, they believe that cows may possess souls of other deceased human beings, and so they won't eat them. But in the United States, we don't believe that, so we freely eat cows.
Okay.
And while this looks like some kind of moral difference, it's only surface level difference, because we both believe it's wrong to eat grandma. Right? So the foundational moral belief is shared. It just sometimes is how we get to that. So I don't think we should deny moral truths just because under certain circumstances it's difficult to know exactly what they are. Just like scientists don't throw out an actual law simply because they don't know the answer to something natural. So moral value is absolute, but the way it's practiced is relative. Like take a greeting. People greet people differently in different cultures. But all cultures think it's good to formally greet someone, but they differ on how to do it. So, regardless, what I'm saying is that these, yes, there are differences, but I think they're ultimately surface level differences. And again, that's talking epistemology, not ontology. That's how we know things.
That's fine. That's fine. But there are societies, or there have been, who not only think it's okay to eat grandma, but think it's wrong not to. There's been cannibalistic societies that that base a lot of, or their ancestor worship and that kind of thing is they, when their elders die, then they have a feast. And so not only is that it's not the case that everybody thinks it's wrong to kill grandma and eat grandma, it's some people think it's immoral, or at least have thought. I don't know about it now, but at least have thought that it was wrong to just why would you bury your ancestors like that and just leave them in the dirt?
Well, I think that would fall back. I see what you're saying, right? But I think that falls back to the whole flat Earth, round Earth. Okay. Just because we don't know that the Earth is round doesn't make the Earth flat, or doesn't mean that we can never know, and that because people differ on their opinions, there's no objective standard out there. That we're talking, you and I right now are talking about epistemology, and since we are people with faculties that could be broken and misled and abused and misunderstood, we could come and draw all kinds of conclusions, but it doesn't mean that there isn't an objective standard out there. It just means that we may have some differences on what we think that objective standard is. But just because we have those differences doesn't mean we can't say that there aren't other things that we ought not to.
So you're saying that it's possible for, so if there is the case where we differ, that the people who thought it was okay to eat grandma were just wrong.
Yeah. So take torturing of a baby. Let's just take torturing of a baby for your fun.
Okay.
So that is objectively morally wrong.
I would agree with that.
Okay. So, but regardless of whether we agree upon that, it's still objectively wrong.
Okay.
So I think I'm trying to distinguish or separate these two layers. Okay. So first, the question is there objective moral values and duties? We both say yes. Now there's two other questions that derive from that. The first question is is, can we know them?
Right.
Can
So
we
we're
know
separating.
what they are? And then the second one is, well, where do they come from? Or maybe that's the first one. I don't know.
We're separating whether or not something actually is wrong from
ontology, from epistemology.
Do we perceive it to be wrong?
Right. Correct.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that's fair. In order for something to be objective, it doesn't necessarily require for us to recognize that it's objective, or for us to recognize what the objective truth is about something.
Right, but you brought up a good point.
Like we said about the center of the earth, right? There's stuff in the center of the earth. We don't, just because we can't recognize, some people might think it's purple, some people might think it's orange, whatever. That doesn't change the fact that there is a thing there and it is a certain color. Is that what you're kind of getting at there?
All I was saying is that I think you did bring up a good point, that it's difficult sometimes to know. I think that most people can agree upon certain foundational moral oughts and ought nots, but it's difficult when you do have people who are have different means or different perceptions about those moral facts.
Okay. Yeah, and I think I would agree on that. I would think, like I said, just because something is objectively true, it doesn't guarantee that we're going to be able to recognize that that's the truth. We might see the wrong thing. We might make a mistake. There might be some kind of systematic error, like optical illusions. Have you seen the optical illusion where there's two line segments and one of them has arrowheads?
One looks longer. Yes.
Shoot, what's it called again?
You have the arrows.
The arrows heads pointing in or out. Yeah. And so even if you know that they're the same length, even if you just measured them, you can't help but see them. One of them's longer than the other, and that's just because of the way our eyes work in our brains. No, that's not a subjective matter. That's just the way that our eyes physically function. Jacked up. Oh, okay. I thought you said that. Okay.
I said that's jacked up, man. I know, because I've seen that before. It's crazy.
Okay. So I think this might be a good place to stop. I think we're going to end up pushing it into a fourth round here.
Yeah, where we're in agreement. Yeah, stop when we're agreeing.
Right. Exactly. And you know what? I agree with that as well.
Don't go to bed angry, Scott. Don't go to bed angry.
Oh, good advice. Good advice. Okay, so just to kind of sum up things, is you were suggesting that goodness flows from God's nature, stems from God's nature, is a characteristic of God's nature, and that if without that nature we couldn't really, we'd be missing something. We'd be unable to hang our hat on a particular morality. Is that? I know that's like the 5-cent version of it, but do you think that at least summarizes?
That's fine.
Okay. Would you add? What would you add to that?
Well, I don't think that you have to know God to be good, and I don't think that you. I don't think that you have to know God to know good. And that I think that the evolutionary process provides us with a sound foundation for things that would benefit society or cultures as a whole. Those things that we talk about, flourishing societies. So there are obviously things that would make societies flourish better than others. Mm-hmm. I'm just not sure we agree upon the fact that is objective, and so. And then I think likewise, if you turn the ball around, I think that that you would say, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that you would say that the grounding these moral oughts and truths would be difficult in God's nature, because you think that we could potentially come to those truths without God. Mm-hmm. Is that right? Is that correct?
Well, I was proposing, a possibility. I was trying to examine whether or not God was needed in your equation. That's what I was suggesting there. Is if there was a perfect nature, if there was a perfect moral nature, isn't that something? If it was in fact a necessary type of thing, then it seems that it wouldn't require the actual God to be there. We could have this descriptor or this description of what a perfectly moral being would look like, and then can draw conclusions from that. If in fact that's there was a necessary nature for a God.
So if I could branch off of this just for a second, I know we said we were going to stop, but I have a question.
Okay.
I think that might help clear it up for me.
The answer is 4.
That's it.
That's it.
It's
the answer's
over.
4.
No, so like if you go back to that meter bar, right?
Uh-huh.
So now I'll lay this out, and then you kind of tell me kind of maybe where I'm going wrong. So like the meter bar that's in whatever Weights and Bureau's office, they decided, okay, that this meter, that this bar will be what we call a meter. And it has the property of now being a meter. It is that standard by which we use.
Right.
If that meter bar wasn't there, how would we decide, or how would we get to that exact meter bar?
Well, I think, and I could be wrong on this, I'm a little rusty in this area. It's been a while since I've had to research the metric system. But from what I understand is that there is, and they might have refined a meter over the years, but there is so they can define a meter, not necessarily just based on this iron. It's not like they just hacked out a chunk of iron and said, here's a meter, from now on, this is a meter. Right. So okay. I believe, and again, I could be wrong here. I believe it's based off of some kind of physical property. Light travels a certain distance. I don't know. I'll look it up before we come back to the next one.
I would love to know that,
because I know that things like temperature, for example, the metric system for temperature, the Celsius system, is based off of the boiling temperature and the freezing temperature of water at sea level.
Right.
And so even if we didn't happen to have any water on us at the time, we could still make an argument, or we could still describe perfectly what 0 Celsius or what 1 meter or, what 1 liter or, whatever, we could still describe those. And so what I'm saying is that if you said that we could infer with perfect certainty the what constituted the nature of God. And what I'm saying is that if that's the case, then since our any perceptions we have, we know could be fallible, but if we can purely philosophically, reasonably infer those characteristics, and if that's a necessary inference, then it can't be related on whether or not the God is actually there. We'd say, if there was no God, we could still say, well, what if there was a God? What would it be like? And we would all agree that it has to be this perfect way. And we'd say, oh, yeah, so that must be what morality is. Let's go on that. Even if there was no God, we could still come to that conclusion of what a perfect God would be like. And if we say, okay, from there, we can infer what morality is.
No, I think I see where you're going with that. And I really don't know if I have much to say about that. I would say probably that I'm not sure that's the case. I would have to think on it more.
Okay.
But then I think that my main point, my big point would be is that I don't think that that could be obligatory. That we could call those duties. Uh-huh. Maybe we could call those some kind of moral things or whatever. But I don't know that you can enforce laws without a lawgiver. I don't think that it could be something that I can hold you culpable for. Mm-hmm. But that's neither here nor there.
That's actually a perfect segue into to our next part, which we'll pick up at a different episode. So what is the best? What is morality, and what does it mean? What would be the best way to measure morality, and what would make the most sense? So that's going to be what we're gonna talk about next time, and so that will wrap up round 3. Ding ding. And that was more on morality. Boy, it seems like it's just something that's never, it's a well that's never going to run dry, to go back to that same metaphor.
Never run dry. We will. Yep.
So people have been talking about morality for centuries and millennia. And ever since people could talk and consider things, ever since we, developed our ability to reason, people have been talking about morality. And so that's probably something that's never going to go away, which is fine. I mean, it's an interesting thing to talk about, I think. And I'm glad that we can actually, have a civil conversation, because I know a lot of times that's something that people can get heated up about.
They
and
sure can. I mean, it's a very personal, of course, everything we talk about typically is hits on a personal foundational level. And when that happens, we immediately go into fight or flight kind of, a position.
Right.
So it's hard to be civil.
Yep.
It's hard to be civil.
It is. Well, it's good. It's good that you and I have an opportunity to practice that.
That's right.
And so we can get better at it and so on. But on a lighter side here, we're going to go back to a bit. We've done this a few times in previous episodes, and that is spin the wheel. And in this, just to remind our viewers, in this bit, what we do is Jamie and I each have a bunch of surprise questions for the other person. And so what we do is we spin the wheel and pick one at random, and then the other person has 2 minutes to answer that. And so let's just dive right into that. Let's go to spin the wheel.
Spin that wheel.
Jamie, you ready to spin the wheel?
Yeah, baby. No whammy.
All right, here we go. And all right. And so your topic is justice.
Oh,
justice. Boy. And so here's the question. So I've heard some Christians say things like, God is a just being. God is a just God. I'm sure that doesn't come as a surprise to anyone, that God is a just God. And so justice, basically, we can define as getting what you deserve, right? If somebody is a bad person, then justice would mean that there's some kind of punishment or retribution or recompense going to be due from them. But on the other side of the coin, we have mercy. We have mercy. I'm sure you've heard this comparison before. And so other Christians will say things like God is a merciful God. And so we could also loosely define mercy as you don't get what you deserve. So you were bad, but the judge has mercy, and so doesn't give you a bad punishment or whatever. So, and I've also heard many Christians say both at the same time, which it would seem to be contradiction. So you either do get what you deserve, justice, or you don't get what you deserve, mercy. So my question to you then is, how do you combine those? What's your position? Which side do you support, if either, or if both? How does that resolve? And I will start the timer.
Okay, so God's justice and God's mercy, I think that they are mutually compatible. I think God, in order to be a being that is worthy of worship, God has to be perfectly just. But God is also perfectly merciful. And at first, it might seem like a contradiction. I might call it a conundrum, something maybe that I don't quite understand. I'm not completely throwing it out to like mystery. But what I will say is this: in this lifetime, in the Bible, it talks about how it rains on the just and the unjust alike. So good people get good things, and bad people get good things as well. There's nothing in this life that really brings about justice or mercy in a perfect way. And that's why we as Christians believe there's an afterlife. So that in the afterlife, you will either get justice or be given mercy, depending upon your decision in the here and now. If you decide, God, I don't want anything to do with you, then God, in order to be perfectly just God, has to punish you for your misbehavior. And that punishment is separation from him for all of eternity. Now, as Christians, we also believe in mercy, but our our misbehaviors don't go unpunished. That's the whole reason for the cross. We believe that God came down and took our misbehaviors, our sins upon himself on the cross, thus still allowing him to be just. So those sins that we have committed have been atoned for through Jesus, and now he could pour out mercy on us in eternity.
Ooh, under the wire.
Woo.
Got that one in.
Barely.
I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to say that I'm betting we're going to get a little bit of feedback on that with some questions.
I hope so. Yeah.
So maybe we'll save those for maybe we'll come circle back around and come into that. But thank you. That was a good answer, and so I appreciate that. And so now here's your chance to spin the wheel for me.
Spin it. Here we go. Okay, you have landed on proof. Proof.
All right.
So the question is, must we be able, now this is directed just to you, towards you, must we be able to demonstrate God's existence through the scientific method? Or is there other ways by which you think that God could be justifiably believed in, maybe through something like philosophy? So can we, I don't want to say prove in the Cartesian sense, but could we convince you through other means other than the scientific method? Or do we have to come up with strictly some kind of naturalistic evidence for God before you would consider that possibly, good enough evidence for God's existence?
All right.
And here we go.
Ready with the timer?
Yep.
Okay. So, my short answer is going to be, I don't know. And so what I will say is that, you mentioned the scientific method, and, from what I see, the scientific method, basically it's the most reliable method that we have for determining what's true and what's not true. I mean, there's a handful of ways that we can, or maybe more than a handful, many, many different ways that we can use to determine what's correct and what's not correct, what's real, what's not real, what's right, what's wrong, and that kind of thing. The scientific method has been very effective, and is clearly the most reliable method that we have for determining truth. Now, that is not to say that you have to go through the scientific method to determine whether or not, like in this case, there's a God. So I would be open to other forms of being convinced. I think that it's easy to fall back on tried and true methods. And so, I mean, that's a powerful tool that we have. And so it's easy to see where your question comes from, I guess. And that is that, we have that, and we use that over and over again. We use it all the time. I think it would be an uphill battle to throw in a new technique. I mean, you would need to, first of all, justify your method. Okay. So if you want to use some other kind of method, you said philosophical. Well, actually, the scientific method is a philosophical method. It's an approach. It's a way of addressing a particular type of question. But I think that I would be open to other things, but it would require using an untested method or introducing a new method. And so you'd need to justify. You need to build my confidence in your new method of approach.
Gotcha.
Does that seem to answer your question there?
Very
okay.
Good. Yep.
So then that's it.
Thank you, buddy.
Even though I went over time a little bit.
That's all right. I'll let you slide this time.
All right.
Next time I'm pulling out my big hook and the gong and you're coming off the stage, man.
Just the other day I was explaining to my son about the Gong Show.
Yeah, he did. He's too young. He's never seen or heard of the Gong Show.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes we'll listen to music on shuffle, right? And so these songs come up, and every once in a while I'll say gong, and I'll hit the next, hit the forward to the next song.
Yeah, that's
perfect. Like, what the heck are you talking about? And so anyway,
that's great. I love it.
All right, so that is Spin the Wheel.
I love those spin the wheels, man. I just never know what I'm going to get.
They're fun. I kind of like, the challenge of thinking off the cuff. And
I've had a lot of response, actually, that's of all of our side bits. That's the one I think people like the most. Yeah, they say they really love the spin the wheel. So
maybe the fact that you and I enjoy it so much, maybe that shows through a little bit.
Maybe that's it. Yep.
Speaking of side bits, though, we do have, we're starting this year in 2020, I guess what we're calling it, the God or Not Book Club or something along that line. And so Jamie and I basically are going to be reading a book together, and then every episode or every episode or every other episode or however we end up doing it, we'll pause and we'll talk a little bit about what we've been reading. And so our first book that we're going to do, I chose for Jamie and I to read, and this is called Sense and Goodness Without God, A Defense of Metaphysical Naturalism. And this is by Richard Carrier. And so Jamie and I, and we want to encourage or invite, I should say, our listeners to follow along if they would like to, and they can read with us, and they can even kick in some feedback. And if you get your feedback in soon enough, then we will incorporate that into our discussion. And so, again, the book was Sense and Goodness Without God by Richard Carrier. And so today is January 7th. And so we'll be talking about the first section, actually the first two sections. The first section is just the intro. And so we'll be looking at the second section then, How We Know, it's called, the section called How We Know. And it's the first two sections are about 60 some pages. And so it's not too big of a dive for anybody to follow along with. So if to our listeners, if you would like to participate in the book club, then please have your comments into us by January 14th. Because we do the recording, obviously we don't record it live on January 21st, the next episode. Although that might be interesting to do at some point, have a live episode.
Yeah.
But that way we can incorporate your comments into the discussion. So again, that was January 14th, and you can just email your comments or questions into the email at godornotpodcast.com. And so that is on section 1, which is the intro, and then section 2, which is the first of several meaty sections to come.
That'll be fun.
Yeah. And I think the 60 pages is not a terribly long read. Maybe we'll dive into, bigger chunks in later, once we get rolling, but, we'll just see how that goes.
For those of you who are listeners or of quote books, Audible does have it. I purchased it from Audible, and I will be quote reading my book.
Okay.
During my commutes. So for those of you who might want to you have a commute or a drive and you want to participate in this, and you can't get your hands on a book, you could go to Audible and get that. Yep. And one cool thing about Audible, you could speed that baby up. So like I've gotten to the point now with most of the with most of the books, I could usually quote read it at double time. I usually start it at time and a half.
Right.
And then about a quarter of the way through the book, I bump it up. And then halfway through the book, I'm usually at double time. So I could bust through these books in, twice as fast sometimes.
Right.
So that's a nice little tip. And that was free from myself to you.
Tips on, life hacks from Jamie Goodlett, right?
That's right. Yeah.
The thing that I listen to Audible books or audio version of books occasionally as well. The thing I don't like about that, though, is I like to have a highlighter, and I like to, stick Post-it notes and stuff into the books and so on.
I love that too. So usually I have to get myself a hard back copy as well, because some of these books that at least that I listen to are hard to listen to because they're deep. Like now I'm listening to, metaphysics and stuff. I mean, those are meaty, difficult, heady subjects to wrap your mind around just listening to. So a lot of times I have to have a hard copy.
Especially if you're listening to a chipmunk read it to you.
That's right. Yeah. That's how you edit us, don't you?
I do.
That's a little insight into the editing process.
When I'm editing the episodes, I play them back at I can't go 2 times speed, 1.5 times speed though, and helps me to get through it a little more quickly. But anyway, so that's going to be the book club, and one more time, that was Sense and Goodness Without God by Richard Carrier, and that about wraps it up for episode number 11. Please send us your ideas, questions, and comments to email at godornotpodcast.com. If you'd like to know more about the topics covered in this episode, Jamie would recommend what?
I'm recommending Legislating Morality. Is it wise? Is it legal? Is it possible? By Norman Geisler and Frank Turek. It's a very good book that talks basically about how everyone legislates morality. The question is, whose morality are we going to legislate? I thought it was a pretty good read, and I think at least some of our listeners will agree. Okay.
All right. And I recommend a book by a psychologist by the name of Paul Bloom, and it's called Just Babies: The Origins of Good and Evil. And I like the title because it's a double entendre. It's, just babies, like, oh, we're just babies. We're only babies when we're born. But then as far as justice is concerned, just babies.
Very clever.
And the thesis of the book is that much of our moral sense is innate, and so he talks about how you can see some of these moral issues with cleverly designed experiments, and you put babies in these different situations and see how they react and that kind of thing. Actually, the book it's kind of a double message there. One is that we have this innate moral sense when we're born, and the second thing though is that that innate moral sense has some definite flaws and shortcomings, and how as we grow and mature, then it takes that raw material that we're born with, and it kind of molds it into something that's more moral, I guess, to use that word there. Yeah. And so it's an interesting psychological approach. It's not about, it doesn't really address religion in either direction. And so I think that people with a religious perspective could get a lot out of this book, as well as people without a religious perspective. But again, the book is called Just Babies: The Origins of Good and Evil, and it's by Paul Bloom. All right. And so thank you all for joining us. We hope you'll be back with us next time, when Jamie and I will be talking about prejudice and how it relates to various religious and non-religious topics. And until then, this is your dialectic duo reminding you to talk to each other.
See ya.
This has been the God or Not podcast. Send your questions or comments to email at godornotpodcast.com. If you'd like to support the show or grab some God or Not gear, please visit the website at www.godornotpodcast.com. Thanks for listening.